Welcome to the Daily Word Bible Study, a plain and simple book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse study through the entire Bible. We are in the Gospel of John, chapter 5. And, we're kind of in this section of John. John has a lot of discourse. More so, for example, Mark's Gospel. Mark's Gospel has a lot more action. It's going from what Jesus did, but John, I would say Matthew had a lot some dialogue, but usually contention, and we're going to see it here with John, but a lot of discourse. So yeah, you see that Jesus is confronted by a situation or a question, and then you see how he responds to these questions. So, and it's kind of a long chapter, but let's see how far we get through it for this study. So let's go, John chapter 5. Now, what's going to be interesting is how some of these incidents were going to spark the reaction from Jesus. Verse 1 says, after this, a Jewish festival took place, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now, again, you could say Jesus was a devout Jew. And he was more than that, obviously. His family, we'll see that later in chapter 6, but the point is that he was always at Jerusalem. This is what the law required: 3 times a year. Male Jews were required to appear in Jerusalem for the festivals. All right. So verse 2 says, by the sheep gate in Jerusalem, there is a pool called Bethesda. Bethesda, I think it is. I want to say Bethesda, but it's not Bethesda. In Hebrew, which has 5 colonnades, within these lay a large number of the sick, blind, lame, and paralyzed. Now, here you're going to see verse from this point on, and in verse 4 is in italicized. When you see this here, let me just see something right quick. Because I want to make a point from this. The italicized means that it wasn't in the original manuscripts. Now, in order to understand, for example, why we have our New Testament, English translation, not New Testament, but it's English translations. These come from the manuscripts, the Greek manuscripts, and again, and again, the reason I'm making this point to go here to do this here. Let's see. All right. So in some translations, and if you have a Bible app translation, okay, if you have a Bible app translation, let me show you this here. Okay, so, all right, let me show you some of this here. We're doing a little, I don't know if you can see this here. I'm trying to, all right, okay. So there are several Bible apps online, and as you could see, all of these here are translations, or really English translations. And with this list, there's a couple of, I guess, Arabic, and then there's Greek. And if I switch on to it, it'd be all Greek, but mostly English translations, okay? And the reason why I say that is because all of these translations, you have to understand why we have them, and sometimes we people don't know why they have them. Um, we kind of think Jesus might have spoken um, Greek, whatever, but he didn't. My point is that as you in some of the translations, the section of let's see here. Okay. Um, I think in the King James there are no italicized here. Um, and we'll get into the reason why. But then the other newer translations, uh, they have the italicized. Okay, the New King James doesn't have them. Now the reason why I'm saying that's important because sometimes with these um, italicized, they let you know that in certain manuscripts there are certain groups of manuscripts, and the reason why I say that is because when you get into what is called scriptural criticism, and you hear people today that will say how sometimes in error the Bible is. And I'm not going to get into it because one, I'm not qualified. I'll defer that to a lot of the scholars. In some cases, you will find notes if you have a study Bible. I think the King James, New King James do not have this italicized. So when you're reading it, they're reading it as if it is in the original. And then there are some translations that when it have waiting for the moving of the water, because an angel would go down into the pool from time to time and stir the water, then the first one who got in after the water was stirred up recovered from whatever ailment he had. Now, this is kind of interesting. I think it needs to be understood because if you ever run across this, someone is going to maybe use this to say, see, your Bible is in error. And that's what I wanted to say is that, okay, when you read the statement, and sometimes there are statements that said, okay, what, for example, there is another in Matthew chapter, I want to show you this. I didn't mean to kind of go this way, but it's really worth us to talk about this because in today's climate, there is a lot of let me see if I can find it. I'm going to show you something right here. I think it's Matthew I want. And I hope I can find this. Oof. Okay, let's see. Here's another one that that is always, in a sense, in question. And he says here, verse 50, Jesus shouted again in a loud voice, with a loud voice, and gave up the ghost. And then verse 51, suddenly the curtain of the sanctuary was split into from top to bottom, and the earthquake and rocks were split, and the tombs were open, and the bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised, and they came out of the tombs after his resurrection into the holy city and appeared to many. Now, when you read this, you go, what? Okay. It is like, did this really happen? Now, what's amazing, I'm reading from the Holman Christian Standard, and they don't put this in italicized. Other translations do put it in italicized, okay? Which is amazing because it's almost like, what, really? But anyway, so the question is that when this is either true or what? because you hear nothing about this ever in any other passage of Scripture, that the tombs were open and many bodies of the saints who were fallen asleep. In other words, was Abraham and David and all, King Josiah, all them, were they walking around Jerusalem appearing to meet people? Notice that, and they came out of the tombs after his resurrection. Again, there's just absolutely nobody referred to this. In other words, they came out of the tombs, right? If this kind of happened, the fact that they came out of the tomb, at some point you should have some kind of somebody saying this, right? Now, so what's going on here? Some people believe what is called, this kind of got inserted in as a scribal error, found its way in. Usually they will mark this. Okay. Okay. I was trying to see, but anyway. So this is usually marked by that. Let me show you one more. Let me show you one more, and then I'll kind of give you the explanation. And I don't know if I can give an adequate explanation that that would satisfy. Okay, I don't know if there's an adequate explanation that will satisfy. All right, but this is Luke's gospel, and in verse 15 it says, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to the whole creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved. Whoever does not believe will be condemned." Now, this I'm not going to read all that. This section here, and if you notice, where does the italics begin? Because I see it at the bottom here. Oh, from 9? Oh, here it is. So, the italics that begin in verse 9, okay? Okay, so from verse 9. So from verse 9 all the way to the end of the book, 19, in Mark's gospel, and in what we have in most of the translations, the reason why they mark with translations is that this section doesn't appear in a lot of in a lot of the manuscripts. Okay, so just like I read that one story about all of the Old Testament saints coming out of their tombs and appearing to people, that's something that people were like, what? And then as we are reading here, what is in italicized, okay, brackets, right? Waiting for the moving of the water, because an angel would go down into the pool from time to time and stir the water up. Now, before I get back to this, let me just kind of go back and say, it is legitimate and valid questioning. Why is this there? Why do they have these in brackets? And then our critics would say, well, because the Bible is not right. The Bible, is in error. That's what they would say. No, let's understand how we get the English translations. So you have this book here that's written, and then scholars will debate the timing of the New Testament writings. So obviously pro-Christian, pro-biblical writers, which I am, date the writings of the New Testament church, let's say within and by AD 70, with, the letters of John being the last to be written, so somewhere around the late 80s, 90s. Okay, again, that's for the scholars to debate, because I'm not qualified to say from a scholastic this is true or not true. But when these were written, then later you had the copies of the New Testament. So you have copies upon copies. So why was that? The original letters, which we do not have today. So when, in this case, John wrote this letter, the materials that they used were what's called the dried out papyri plants. And then the ink, we don't, okay, which wasn't ink as we know it, but it could have been smudged ash, um, charcoal, something like that, right? You mix it up, and that's what was, their version of ink, and they would write this down, but they would write it on dried out papyri plants. These plants were so flimsy they did not survive. They would wither. But in the meantime, what you would have is then copies upon copies written down. So I'm old enough, and we don't even have this. But back in the day, you would have a tape recorder. Okay, now we have a phone, right? So, but back in the day, you would have tape recorders. I think I still have some of these tapes too. So all these all sermons and stuff, they would record it, and then and us poor folks, we had these little bitty cassette players. You put it in, you can play. Now, if I wanted to dub a tape, I would get another tape recorder, set them side by side, and get a blank tape and then tape it. Okay. Now, the reason why I'm bringing that up is because that method obviously is not the best. You get sounds, you don't always get clear sounds. Watch it, and then sometimes things could be, like if you were dubbing what I'm saying right here, you could miss a sentence, you could miss a word. All right, so then now you got a copy of a tape, so then you got copies of copies of copies, and of course, back in the New Testament, they were not worrying about copyright. Okay, some Bible translations right now you can get sued. Okay. But back then they wasn't worried about that. They was like, the more the merrier. So people would copy, and they would have copies upon copies upon copies, right? Now, some of these copies, of course, over time became fragments. You had certain sections, entire sections maybe, but because of the flimsiness of the material, you would have these different copies. And over time, when they began to collect these copies, then you could piece them together. Now, also you had groups of copies. Okay, you can get into that kind of scholarly work. So this set of copies and that set of copies. So then it's copies upon copies upon copies. And so to date, we have some, I want to say 30,000 preserved copies. And these are copies of copies, anything from fragments to sometimes maybe whole to pages, right? But just copies, and you have enough of them where you could kind of piece together, for example, the Gospel of John. Okay, so now in the copies, then this is where you find sometimes problem verses. So like if you're reading certain groups of manuscripts, okay, like we just read with Mark, from verse 9 on, in certain manuscripts, that Mark just abruptly ends. So where did the other come from? I don't know. But in this case here, when they would see that, okay, waiting for the movement of the water, well, that was problematic because like, what? What do you mean the moving of the water? Okay. And um, but again, the point here is that there were certain manuscripts you didn't see this, or if it was in the manuscript, they can say, well, something's not right. It would be like if you're looking at this letter here, and then all of a sudden it might be a different type of font. for lack of a better term, okay? And that was kind of the what we would call cut and paste, but horribly. In other words, the point is that the the scholars said there's an issue with this, so that's why they put it in brackets. Okay, I'm gonna pick this up in the next verse. It's important to just kind of understand that, because let me just say this in closing. While people pick at this but try to say that the Bible is not reliable, it is reliable, because when it comes to truth, the truth of the gospel, okay, that part, yeah, you could probably kind of put a question mark. Like I could say definitely, like, okay, all of a sudden, you know, you know, as in Matthew said, that all of a sudden the bodies, the tombs are open. That's a pretty big thing, that tombs were open. And how many tombs, right? How many people actually got out of the tombs and walking around and appearing, notice this, and appearing to people. Now, one of the testimonies that Paul wrote about the resurrection of Jesus, 500 people saw it. And many of them are alive today. So here you have that when people would say, yeah, it'd be something to be able to broadcast or to be able to report somebody raised from the dead in the fashion that Jesus raised from the dead. And nobody saw it. And the fact that Jesus did not hide it either. So now you're going to say the Old Testament saints came out of tombs and were appearing to people, and you have no testimony on it. So more on this later, but don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome, and I'll see you in the next study.